Picture this. You're a mom, running an errand at the mall. Your 6-year-old wants to watch some older kids play video games while you go grab a lamp 2 aisles over. You've done this 100 times. It's 1981. Every parent did this. You're gone for less than 10 minutes. You come back, and he's not there. Not wandered off, not there. Not hiding in a clothing rack, not there. Gone. And 2 weeks later, 2 men fishing a canal 100 miles from that mall pull a child's severed head out of the water. That's how the Adam Walsh case starts. But here's the part that's going to make you furious, and it's the reason we're doing this video. The man almost everybody believes did it confessed to the murder in horrifying detail, and then died in prison 13 years later, having never once stood trial for it. Police didn't officially name him as the killer until 2008, 27 years after Adam disappeared. And even then, there was no trial, no jury, no conviction, just a press conference. I'm going to walk you through the entire thing. The day Adam vanished, every single thing the police got wrong in the hours and years that followed, the suspect who couldn't stop confessing and unconfessing to the same crime, and the legal system that somehow let a man already convicted of 6 other murders die of natural causes without ever facing a jury for the one crime that made him infamous. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why one grieving father single-handedly forced a national missing children system into existence, and why the man police eventually blamed for his son's death never had to answer for it in front of 12 jurors. If this is your first time here, welcome to Brocco True Crime, where we don't just tell you what happened, we tell you what should have happened and didn't. Subscribe now, because you are not going to believe how badly this case got mishandled at every single stage. It's July 27th, 1981. Hollywood, Florida. The kind of oppressive, wet heat Florida summer day where a mall isn't just a place to shop, it's a place to exist without melting. Reve Walsh takes her son Adam there. She needs a lamp. That's the whole errand. Inside the Sears department store, right near the entrance, there's a display of Atari 2600 consoles and a cluster of older boys already crowded around it. Adam, 6 years old, wants to watch. Reve tells him to stay put. She'll be right back, just over in lighting, a few aisles away. This is not a controversial parenting decision in 1981. This is what shopping with kids looked like for an entire generation before this exact case rewrote the rules. While she's gone, a teenage store security guard breaks up an argument among the older boys over whose turn it is on the console and clears the whole group away from the display, sending them, by most accounts, toward an exit. What role Adam played in that moment, whether he left willingly with the older kids, was pulled aside separately, or slipped out completely alone, has been debated by investigators, journalists, and true crime researchers for more than 40 years. And we're going to explain exactly why that debate never got resolved. What we do know is this. When Reve comes back for her son, the crowd that had swarmed that video game display minutes earlier is completely gone. And so is Adam. She checks the toy department. Nothing. She goes back to lighting in case they'd somehow crossed paths. Nothing. She has him paged over the mall's intercom. Adam Walsh, please come to customer service. A line that, if you know this case at all, you've probably heard word for word. He doesn't come. John Walsh gets to the mall and, by several accounts, is practically begging responding officers to bring in real search resources, dogs, more units, anything, and gets brushed off by at least one officer for being too pushy. Sit with that. A father is being told to calm down while his son has been missing for less than an hour. That single moment tells you almost everything about how this entire case was about to be handled. For 2 weeks, there's an enormous, sprawling search. Volunteers, multiple agencies, national media attention that, frankly, almost no missing child got in 1981. Adam's case is one of the first to feel like a genuine, sustained, nationwide story about a missing kid, which tells you something uncomfortable about how invisible most missing children cases were before this one. Then, on August 10th, more than 100 miles north near Vero Beach, 2 fishermen loading their boat into a drainage canal spot something floating. They think, at first, it's a doll. It's Adam's head. That's all that was ever found. His body has never been recovered, not in over 40 years. The Walshes learned the news while out of state in New York, where they'd traveled for a scheduled television appearance to keep pressure on the search. They find out their son is dead from hundreds of miles away, and the story breaks in the papers before they've even had a chance to process it privately. There is no version of this that isn't gutting. Investigators bring the remains to a regional morgue for identification, and the next afternoon's local paper runs the story with a front-page photo before the family has even had a private moment to process what's happened. And this, the discovery of a child's severed head in a rural drainage canal, is only the beginning of what went wrong here, because everything that comes next, every failure we're about to walk through, happened either before this discovery or in the years immediately following it, when this case should have been moving toward an answer and instead kept stalling out. Understand what we're dealing with here before we go further. An autopsy would later determine both the cause of death and the exact method used to decapitate Adam, clinical specific findings that would end up mattering enormously 3 years later, when a suspect's own account of the crime would either match those findings or contradict them. That gap between matched and contradicted is going to define the next 27 years of this story, so keep it in mind. If you take one thing away from this video, let it be this section, because the failures here are not subtle, and they are not disputed. Even the department itself has, decades later, admitted to them on the record. First, the eyewitness problem. The security guard who cleared the kids away from that video game display, her name was Kathy Schaffer, sometimes recorded as Catherine Schaffer Barrack, became the center of a years-long argument about whether she'd inadvertently sent Adam out toward the parking lot along with a group of older boys, possibly through a side garden center exit, instead of back toward his mother in lighting. Investigators pulled her account apart repeatedly, had her walk through the sequence of events again and again over the years, and according to multiple people who later reviewed the file, she ended up treated less like a witness with genuinely useful information, and more like a scapegoat, a convenient, low-level employee to point fingers at, while the department's own response time in that critical first hour got a lot less scrutiny than it deserved. It's a lot easier to blame a teenage security guard for one bad call than it is for a police department to admit it moved too slowly. Also worth flagging, there's real disagreement, even decades later, about exactly how much time passed between Adam being reported missing at customer service and this actually being treated as a full-scale police search rather than a routine, lost kid at the mall situation. In a case like this, every single minute matters, and by several accounts, those first couple of hours did not move with the urgency that, in hindsight, they obviously should have. Second, and honestly the most maddening, the lost evidence. When detectives eventually connect a suspect to a Cadillac he'd been driving, they find what looks like blood on the floorboards, on both the front and rear carpeting. They pull the carpet out as evidence, and they also locate a machete the suspect likely had access to through the business where he'd purchased the car. This is 1983. DNA testing doesn't exist yet, but blood typing does, and basic evidence preservation absolutely does. And somehow, between collection and storage, Both that blood-stained carpet and the car itself disappear. Lost. Not tested. Not preserved. Not available for comparison. Just gone. Through what can only be described as a catastrophic chain of custody failure. For a case that was going to spend the next 25 years needing physical evidence to either confirm or destroy a suspect's confession, this single failure may be the most consequential mistake in the entire investigation, because it meant that decades later, when investigators finally had a name and a story, they had almost nothing physical left to test it against. Third, the national infrastructure simply didn't exist yet. It took roughly a week to get the FBI involved in a case involving a child who had very plausibly been taken across county lines. And there was no missing children file in the National Crime Database law enforcement used for almost everything else. The same federal system, the National Crime Information Computer, that could flag a stolen car, a stolen boat, or even a stolen plane within seconds, had no equivalent category for a missing 6-year-old. Investigators, by some accounts, initially couldn't even get Adam's information entered into that system at all. Read that back. A stolen boat, trackable nationally in seconds. A missing child, not yet, in 1981. A gap so glaring in hindsight that fixing it became one of the very first priorities of the advocacy work that grew directly out of this case. Fourth, pure jurisdictional chaos. Adam vanishes in Broward County. His remains surface in Indian River County, over 100 miles away. Different departments, different files, different detectives, working the same case from opposite ends without a unified system to connect them. This is exactly the kind of gap that multi-agency task forces exist to close today. And in 1981, it mostly just meant delay, duplicated effort, and information that took far too long to travel from one desk to another. Fifth, and this one's almost too on the nose, when the case eventually connects to a suspect held in a Florida prison on unrelated charges, and that suspect starts confessing, the very detectives responsible for verifying his story are working off a file that's already missing key physical evidence because of the mistakes made years earlier. In other words, the department's own early failures directly crippled its ability to confirm or disprove a confession when one finally landed in their lap. That's not two separate problems. That's one long chain of consequences, and it starts on day one. And finally, this is the one that should really get under your skin. Once Hollywood PD actually had a suspect and a set of confessions in hand, different detectives over the following 2 decades kept flip-flopping on whether they even believed the guy. Some investigators dismissed him almost completely for years at a stretch. Others latched onto him hard. The case swung back and forth, depending on which detective happened to be holding the file that year, not because of any new evidence, just because of who was reading the old evidence and how convinced they happened to be. When the department finally closed this case in 2008, the sitting police chief stood up at a press conference and did something almost unheard of. He apologized, publicly, for numerous missteps in the original investigation, and admitted the department had spent years chasing other leads instead of focusing on their strongest suspect. That's not a true crime YouTuber's opinion. That's the Hollywood Police Department's own words. So who is this suspect everyone keeps circling back to? His name is Otis Elwood Toole, born 1947, Jacksonville, Florida, into a childhood that, by his own later accounts, was brutal. Physical abuse, sexual abuse by multiple family members starting when he was a small child. A mother who reportedly forced him to wear girls' clothing as punishment. None of that is an excuse for anything that came after. It's just the backdrop. As an adult, Toole becomes a drifter, working odd jobs across Florida, Texas, and Michigan, setting fires, and eventually teaming up with another drifter, Henry Lee Lucas, a man who would go on to become one of the most infamous, unreliable confession serial killers in American criminal history. Together, Toole and Lucas would claim to have committed hundreds of murders, at various points invoking an alleged cult they called the Hand of Death. Investigators from multiple states spent years trying to verify these claims, and largely couldn't, because the two men's accounts kept contradicting each other, contradicting the physical evidence, and contradicting themselves from one interview to the next. Lucas, in particular, is now widely believed to have confessed to killings he had absolutely nothing to do with, purely because confessing got him perks in custody. Better food, more attention from investigators, road trips out of his cell to revisit crime scenes that gave him hours outside a prison wall. Toole gets swept up in that exact same storm of unreliable, attention-driven confession, and untangling what he actually did from what he simply said he did became close to impossible for anyone trying to build an actual criminal case against him. Toole is arrested in 1983 on unrelated charges, and while sitting in a Florida prison that October, he tells investigators he killed Adam Walsh. The confession is graphic. He describes grabbing Adam near a bus bench outside the Sears. He describes the boy crying for his mother on the drive. He describes stopping at a bridge and using a machete to decapitate him. Investigators actually drive him through Hollywood so he can retrace the road on tape, narrating the entire abduction like he's giving a tour. Some details line up disturbingly well with facts that weren't public, including, by some accounts, a description of the decapitation method that matched the autopsy. Other details fall apart almost instantly. He gets Adam's hair color wrong, gets his clothing wrong, and initially claims Henry Lee Lucas was there with him. Investigators quickly prove Lucas was sitting in a jail cell in Virginia the entire time Adam was abducted. That part of the story is provably false. A few months later, Toole recants everything. And then this becomes the pattern for the rest of his life. Confess. Recant. Confess again, differently, to a completely different detective in a different state. At one point telling an investigator he brought Adam's body back to Jacksonville and burned it in his mother's yard. At another point, telling a Texas detective, almost offended by the suggestion, "I wouldn't do that. Not no little kid," and laughing it off. Less than a day later, talking to that same detective, he changes his story again and says yes, he did kill Adam and dismembered him, then contradicts himself again in the same conversation and says the body was left intact. He tells one interviewer he ate part of the boy. Every single one of these accounts came out of a separate interview, often with a detective from an entirely different jurisdiction, hoping Toole could clear an unrelated murder off their own books. Forensic psychologists who evaluated him for his other murder trials pointed to a documented low IQ, severe childhood trauma, and a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia as possible reasons his story kept shifting so wildly. So which is it? Was this a genuinely remorseless child killer, performing horror for whichever detective happened to be in the room? Or a deeply damaged, suggestible man telling everyone exactly what he thought they wanted to hear? The same pattern that later got Henry Lee Lucas's confessions almost entirely discredited across dozens of other cases? There are serious, credentialed people who believe each version. And that unresolved question is exactly why this case dragged on for 27 years without ever producing a conviction. Here's the part of this story that should make you angry, no matter which theory about Toole you personally believe. Set Adam Walsh completely aside for a second. By his own guilty pleas and jury convictions, Otis Toole was a multiple murderer. In 1982, he locked a 64-year-old man named George Sonnenberg inside his own home and set it on fire, killing him. Convicted in 1984. Sentenced to death. That same year, he's convicted of kidnapping and murdering a 19-year-old woman, Ada Johnson, taken at gunpoint from a nightclub, shot, her body left in the woods. A second death sentence. 2 separate juries, 2 separate murders, 2 death sentences. Both of them get overturned on appeal and reduced to life in prison, with his defense team successfully arguing that his documented mental illness, expert testimony described paranoid schizophrenia, meant the death penalty shouldn't stand. In 1991, while already behind bars, he pleads guilty to 4 more murders in Jacksonville, adding 4 more life sentences, bringing his total to 6 confirmed murder convictions. Now really think about that. The state of Florida decided, twice, in front of 2 separate juries, that this man deserved to die for what he'd done to other people. And twice, his own defense attorneys successfully kept him alive on appeal, using arguments about his documented mental state. Arguments a court accepted both times. Meanwhile, at the exact same moment, the case connecting him to a 6-year-old's decapitation sat completely stalled, because the police department investigating it had already lost the physical evidence that might have proven it one way or the other. There's something almost unbearable about that timeline, a legal system moving heaven and earth to spare this man's life for crimes he was already convicted of, while the one case that made him a household name in America never even got the chance to be tested in front of a jury. He spent over a decade in Florida's prison system, at one point housed in a cell near Ted Bundy himself, while that unresolved question about Adam Walsh just sat there, unanswered, year after year. He died of liver failure in September 1996, at 49 years old, in a prison cell in Rayford, Florida. No relative claimed his body. He was buried in a prison cemetery, with no headstone marking who was in the ground. No trial for Adam Walsh ever happened, not because prosecutors didn't think he was capable of it, but because the case they had, thanks to those early evidence failures, was never strong enough to survive a jury. And by the time anyone tried to rebuild it, the man at the center of it was already dead. And before we move on, there's one more name that refuses to leave this case alone, and it's the one that keeps this case alive in true crime forums and comment sections decades later. In 1981, Jeffrey Dahmer, years before his own crimes in Milwaukee became public knowledge, was living in South Florida, stationed nearby, and reportedly within a short drive of that exact mall around the time Adam disappeared. The overlap in timing and geography is well documented enough that it's been seriously examined on national television, with independent researchers laying out a circumstantial case for the timeline, cross-referencing Dahmer's known movements against the day Adam vanished. Dahmer himself was eventually interviewed by investigators and denied any involvement, and he was never formally named a suspect by the department that eventually closed the case in 2008. Most serious researchers who've studied the file call the Dahmer angle intriguing, but ultimately unproven. More coincidence of timing than actual evidence. We're not telling you it's likely. We're telling you it's a real, documented theory that a chunk of the true crime community still isn't ready to let go of, and it's a huge part of why closed and solved ended up meaning 2 very different things for this particular case. For most of the 90s and early 2000s, this case sits in limbo. Tool's dead. No charges were ever filed. John Walsh keeps saying publicly he believes Tool did it. The department that investigated it won't officially agree. That changes in 2006, when a retired Miami Beach homicide detective named Joe Matthews takes a fresh look at the file at the Walsh family's request. He goes back through roughly 100 old case photos of Tool's Cadillac, taken back in 1983, and says he spots something everyone else missed, what he describes as a faint, bloody image on the carpet behind the driver's seat, consistent with a young child's face. Hollywood's new police chief, Chad Wagner, orders a full formal review based on that and the rest of the old file. On December 16, 2008, Wagner holds a press conference and officially closes the case, naming Otis Toole as Adam Walsh's killer. John and Reve Walsh, along with the 3 children they had after Adam, sit behind him on the dais. For a family that had waited 27 years to hear a name said out loud, with any official weight behind it, this understandably plays like the end of a nightmare, the closing of a chapter that had defined their entire adult lives. But here's what a lot of the coverage that day glossed right over. There's no new DNA, no new forensic test, no new eyewitness. What the department actually has is a fresh reread of the same decades-old file, Toole's confessions, his known movements, and that reinterpreted photograph that adds up, in the department's own words, to enough circumstantial confidence to close the case administratively. Journalists who dug into the public records released alongside the announcement, including reporter Arthur J. Harris, who'd covered this case for years and was in the room that day, raised pointed questions afterward about whether closed actually meant solved, or whether it meant a department finally decided a grieving, high-profile family and a watching national audience deserved an answer, new evidence or not. Local reporters that same evening were openly skeptical on camera, pointing out on the record that nothing had actually been produced that hadn't already existed in some form for years. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. So let's be completely precise about it. A police department publicly naming someone as a killer in a press conference, based on their own internal review of circumstantial evidence, is fundamentally different from a jury finding someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt after hearing both sides argue the case in open court. One of those things happened here. The other one never did. And, because Toole was already dead, never could. Legally, here's exactly what this means and doesn't mean. This is a police department's official conclusion. It is not a criminal conviction. Otis Toole was never indicted, never tried, and never found guilty by a jury of Adam Walsh's murder. He'd already been dead for 12 years when this press conference happened. Whatever you personally believe about his guilt, and the circumstantial case is genuinely substantial, a courtroom never got the chance to test it, and under American law, a press conference is not a substitute for that test, no matter how confident the department sounds standing behind the podium. It's also worth asking why it took until 2006 for anyone to look at those Cadillac photographs with fresh eyes in the first place. The images existed the entire time, taken in 1983, sitting in a case file for over 20 years, available to any detective who reopened the box. It wasn't new technology that finally caught what Matthews says he found. It was, by his own account, simply someone looking harder at evidence that had been sitting there the whole time. That's not a criticism of Matthews. It's a pretty damning statement about how many earlier chances this case had to move forward and didn't. No matter where you land on the "did Toole do it" debate, Adam Walsh's death did not stay a private family tragedy. 3 years after the murder, John Walsh became a founding force behind the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, building, essentially from nothing, the coordinated national infrastructure that flatly did not exist when his own son disappeared. In 1988, he became the host of America's Most Wanted, a show credited with helping law enforcement track down hundreds of fugitives over the decades it ran. And in 2006, Congress passed the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, creating the National Sex Offender Registry that still carries his son's name today. An entire generation of parenting changed because of what happened in that Sears department store. The instinct to keep a hand on your kid in public, the stranger danger programs run through elementary schools, the fingerprint kits handed out at county fairs, the entire cultural shift away from letting a 6-year-old wander a store unsupervised for even 10 minutes. All of it traces back, in some way, to a routine errand in July of 1981 that should never have ended the way it did. John and Reve went on to have 3 more children, and by their own repeated public account, everything they built afterward came from one unbearable fact. The systems that should have protected Adam simply didn't exist yet, and nobody had built them, because nobody had needed to yet. They spent the rest of their public lives making sure other families would never face that exact same silence, the same delays, and the same institutional shrug they encountered in the summer of 1981. It's worth pausing on just how much of the modern missing child response system exists because one family refused to let their son's case fade into a filing cabinet. The Amber Alert framework used across the country today, the standardized way local police now coordinate with state and federal agencies the moment a child goes missing, the very existence of an organization whose entire job is connecting scattered local cases into one searchable national picture. None of that was guaranteed. It took a grieving father turning his own outrage into decades of advocacy work to force it into existence. A suspect police were confident enough to name publicly, but never convicted. A confession that flipped back and forth for 13 straight years from a man whose own mental competency was disputed by expert witnesses in his other trials. A police department that lost the evidence that might have settled everything, took a week to call in the FBI and openly apologize decades later for how badly they'd handled it. 2 death sentences for other murders, both overturned on appeal by his own defense team. And, running underneath every part of it, a legacy that reshaped how an entire country protects its children. That's the Adam Walsh case, in full. The case where police finally said a name, but a courtroom never did. A case where the physical evidence that might have settled everything got lost by the very department investigating it. A case where a documented multiple murderer got to keep breathing for 13 extra years because his own lawyers successfully argued he wasn't mentally competent enough to execute, while nobody in that same legal system could ever bring themselves or find enough evidence to formally charge him with the crime that made him infamous in the first place. Whatever conclusion you personally land on, one thing about this case isn't up for debate. It changed how this entire country searches for missing kids permanently. And it did that because one family refused to let a system's failure be the final word. If you want more cases like this one, broken down properly, with every single failure laid out so you understand exactly what went wrong and why, subscribe to Bracco True Crime. We cover cases like this every week. And drop a comment below. Do you think Tool did it? Or do you think Hollywood PD just needed to close the file after 27 years of unanswered questions?